You're listening to Don't Waste Water.
Does it all have to be financed within water?
So something else could be paying for water?
Yeah, I mean, it does here. It does in Europe. Water doesn't just finance itself. Most of the water utilities are subsidized.
Hello, bonjour, and welcome to the Don't Waste Water podcast.
How many broken hand pumps or how many broken tap stands or anything, that's almost not the important thing. What's important is, are people getting a service? And when that service breaks, how quickly can you get it up and running again? And that's actually led to fostering local enterprises to run rural water services, and people pay for that service. There still needs to be some subsidy from somewhere, but it's like, how do you target those subsidies more effectively?
I'm your host, Antoine Walter, and in today's episode, I'm delighted to welcome Kirsten, Danert, and Furey as my guests.
Groundwater is already very, very important. Groundwater point sources, that means wells, springs, boreholes, provide about half of the population of the subcontinent with their drinking water, water for domestic use. So groundwater is hugely important.
In a lot of places in Africa, there are still untapped reserves of groundwater. And this goes against the general narrative that we're hearing.
Sean is the director of the Rural Water Supply Network.
We could talk about wash technologies till the cows come home, couldn't we?
The need versus the financial capacity and the human capacity, the gap is huge. I thought that was like major, that was like really intense.
That was intense. Oof.
I need a good lunch now.
Kirsten is the founder and director of Ask for Water. The last Super Bowl was held in the Allegiant Stadium in Las Vegas, a place that has a capacity of 65,000 people. If I elected to sit down every single person who's ever listened to this podcast in that stadium, I would need to rent it 5 days in a row, which is an achievement I'm incredibly proud of, because water isn't exactly the kind of topic you'd place on the top of a coolness list. Now, 3 years ago, Xylem took that game to another level by teaming up with Manchester City and producing a video called The End of Football that raised awareness on the consequences of water scarcity. Remember how for all of my listeners, I'd need 5 Allegiant stadiums? Well, Xylem would have needed 30 of them for that video alone. But wait, I thought water is a boring topic. How can it get the attention of 30 stadiums full? Sure, one can argue that Xylem used some cheat codes, like releasing the video on Manchester City's channel, opening it with a 2045 Phil Foden acting as head coach, and so on and so on. Still, impressive performance, absolutely unmatched for a while. Yet, that all changed in November last year when MrBeast released his video where he's drilling 100 wells in Africa. There, no tricks, no superstar beyond Jimmy Donaldson himself, and just water scarcity, water access, water safety, and water development for 10 minutes straight. To host all the people who watched that video, you would not need 5 or 30 Allegiant stadiums, no. You would need 2,400 of them. 2,400 stadiums. 155 million people that watched the video. 214,000 comments, all that for a water development project. Yes, I know, one view on a water-related video doesn't one-to-one equate to someone becoming a water activist and joining the water sector to change the world. But still, first, as I'm recording this, Beast Philanthropy has raised $637,000 from that video alone to drill more wells. And second, that's a whole new bunch of people that have a bit more awareness about the water challenges we face. Now, water development is much more than what's shown in MrBeast's 10-minute summary, and much more than drilling wells and flying out. Water professionals like me may maybe have a remote idea of what it's like for real out there in the field, but even that is still a portion of the truth. Hence, I went to meet with 2 real specialists in the water development field in the offices of the SCAT Foundation in St. Gallen, 2 highly skilled professionals who specifically look to support the 549 million people in the world lacking access to safe drinking water in rural areas, aka the people we see in MrBeast's video, to collect their best practices, advice, wisdom, return on experience, and points of attention, so that our 5 mighty stadiums full of water people get a better understanding of the do's and the don'ts of water development, and so that we have a bedrock to welcome the next stadium full of people who want to drill deeper into the water maze. A long intro, sorry, but remember, if you like what you hear, take this episode and share it with a colleague, a friend, your boss or your team, and I'll meet you on the other side. Sorry to interrupt again, this short history to tell you that this could be your ad if we were to team up and become partners. Get your brand in front of an audience in 146 countries with the US, UK and Canada as the top 3 by the numbers, on a podcast channel that's been repeatedly sustainability number 1 in Israel, Singapore and the Baltics, in the top 10 in France and the Nordics, and almost continuously in the top 50 in the US, UK or Australia. Want to explore partnership options? Then reach out to Antoine at dww.show. The link is in the description, and onto the podcast.
Hi Kirsten, hi Sean, welcome to the show. Before we go into the depth of the topic, can we briefly introduce both of you? What is Ask for Water?
Ask for Water is my own very small one-woman consultancy company, a limited company, providing services for facilitation, training, evaluation, consulting for primarily rural water supplies in Sub-Saharan Africa.
And if I'm right, you just came back from Uganda.
Yes, I did. I lived in Uganda for a long time, half my lifetime ago. I lived there for 10 years, lived and worked there for 10 years. I did my PhD research in Uganda and just carried on staying there until I came to Switzerland in 2008. And I go back as much as I can. So I just come back after from 2 months in Uganda, which was really lovely.
Your major exposure to those water development projects would be in Uganda?
We have now worked in another, I think about 15 countries, mostly in Sub-Saharan Africa. But the depth of understanding of the sector, I have more in Uganda than in the other countries that I've worked with.
Let's just introduce you, Sean. So you're here, the local, because we are in the offices of the SCAT Foundation, where the Rural Water Supply Network is hosted, or a part of it. How does all of that roll out?
SCAT Foundation is a small independent Swiss NGO that focuses on knowledge management and networking and knowledge exchange in the field of development cooperation. We host several networks, knowledge networks, of which our largest is the Rural Water Supply Network, which was co-founded by SCAT and UNICEF and others back in 1992 as the Handpump Technology Network, and has grown from a few hundred people on very focused on handpump technology to now over 15,000 members.
Benevols, or what's the...
They are mostly professionals, mid-career professionals like project managers, engineers, working for government, for NGOs, for development organizations, for private sector companies like drilling companies, whole mix, university researchers. The majority of our members are in Sub-Saharan Africa, either they're African or working in Africa, but we're currently expanding into Asia and Pacific and into Latin America.
And what's your role as the director?
I'm kind of the circus master, I guess. So RWSN doesn't exist as a legal entity. It really is a partnership. So we have an executive committee of now 9 organizations, including development banks, UN, NGOs, research. And then we have another 12 or so theme leaders who are volunteers from a wide range of countries and organizations that volunteer their time to help run the network activities, which include things like webinars, peer-reviewed publications, events, training, all sorts of things. So really trying to bring together anyone who's working in rural water supply in predominantly low and middle income countries to find the information that they need to be able to do their jobs better, to find the people and help that they need, or offer their help and services to others. It's really a real connection point.
The topic we'll discuss today would have been of interest at any time. We've had on that channel several deep dives into SDG 6, or looked differently, the failure to achieve SDG 6 and pushing back the topic since Mar del Plata 1977. It could have been a discussion at any time, but in that context, we have to explain that MrBeast, probably the largest YouTuber by now in the world, has published a video where he's drilling 100 wells in Africa. That video got about 150 million people to watch it, which is an unparalleled exposure for the topic itself, but which also drew a lot of reaction. There was the Kenyan government reacting and basically in a quite nasty fashion. They were activists putting out the racial aspect of it, white people helping black people and so far and so on. I'm not going into that today because I have absolutely no legitimacy to discuss those topics. What's interesting to me is I've reacted as a water professional looking at what they were doing, but I'm by no means a specialist. So I thought I have to reach out to real specialists. And after that long introduction, I'd like to start with a very, 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 very simple question. There are 549 million people in rural areas which don't have access to water at all. Does drilling wells help them?
Generally, yes. For a lot of places, it's the safest available source of water. Those people that where the figures are, it's like they don't have access to water. They do have access to water because otherwise they wouldn't survive, but it's unsafe. It's generally for surface water, so from lakes, from ponds, maybe a bit of rainwater harvesting. The groundwater is found in many parts of the world, not everywhere. And in some areas, it's not suitable for all sorts of reasons, whether it's due to salinity, whether it's due to natural levels of high arsenic or fluoride, whether it's due to pollution that's happened because of human activities, or just salinity. I think a big issue in a lot of areas is that the water is brackish, or it has high levels of iron and manganese, or some chemicals that aren't necessarily harmful to health, but it's just not great.
Groundwater is already very, very important. Groundwater point sources, that means wells, springs, boreholes, provide about half of the population of the subcontinent with their drinking water, water for domestic use. So groundwater is hugely important. But I think it's important when looking at these over half a million people without access to drinking water to look at the context and not to run away with this is a technology for everyone. So to really be quite context specific and think, okay, so in this particular context, how can we bring up the access to safe water for everybody? And drilling boreholes is certainly an important part of that picture.
When I say look at the context, what is the size of the context we're discussing? Is it like a country, a region, or is it like very, very local?
We live in the time of the nation state. So it's very important for the government of that nation state to look at what's relevant for the country. But it needs to be smaller than that, whether kind of a canton level or Gemeinde level, be in Switzerland, district level or sub-county in Uganda, to really look at the needs and what's possible in those specific areas. I've just come back from Uganda, where one of the districts, Jigegwa district, has, I think it's the second lowest coverage in the country, slightly over 30% of people who have access to safe source of drinking water. That has to be looked at as a district and as a subcomponent. Why is it so difficult, and what can be done, and what are people doing already? So you need to look at the national level, but also at the very local level. And ultimately, particularly if you're looking at community-based water sources, it's the community that's very, very important. How are they going to pay for it? How are they going to manage it? How are they connected to others providing support? So it's a whole set of levels that need to be considered.
In a lot of places in Africa, there are still untapped reserves of groundwater. And this goes against the general narrative that we're hearing. And this is the challenge of communicating on these issues, because a lot of the agencies that are working in groundwater globally are trying to make the case that groundwater is under threat, it's being over-abstracted, it's being polluted. And that's absolutely correct for most of the world, but not in a lot of Sub-Saharan Africa, where there is still a lot of potential. But even within that, there's nuance in the fact that the researchers were looking, for example, at the aquifers that supply Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and finding that the groundwater levels there are declining drastically. There's localized pockets of over-abstraction.
You rapidly skimmed over the water quality. If I look from a European eye, in Switzerland, in France, in the UK, in Germany, you would not, in most of the cases, drill a hole, take out the water and drink it. You would always have an ultrafiltration or a UV disinfection, or at least a chlorination. There would be some kind of treatment. If you're super lucky, because Switzerland has some pristine waters, that treatment might be very limited. If you're a bit less lucky, that treatment can be very, very intensive. Is it realistic to say that you can, if you take one of these districts where 30% of the people have access to water today, that the other 70% could get it from groundwater without treatment? You just dig a hole and you pump?
Earlier in my career, when I worked for the Environment Agency in the UK, in water resources regulation, I would say that the big issue with European groundwater is just the level of agriculture over many, many decades, and the use of so many different chemicals means that, it's probably not safe to use the groundwater directly
because of soil pollution,
because of pollution over a very long period of time in areas which don't have that level of agricultural intensity. You should always have the water quality tested, and this is part of another research project that we're involved in, funded by USAID, called Real Water, which is looking at how to support water quality testing labs in countries like Ghana, in Kenya, in Uganda, in Tanzania, so that when a borehole is drilled, the services are there to get the water quality tested to a good standard, so people can say, yes, that is safe. Not just once off when the borehole is drilled, but on a routine basis, and that kind of feeds into the broader way that water needs to be managed and regulated.
Are we touching here on what might be the limitation of the approach, where you come in, bore a hole, and there's water? It means you have to think what you just said, which is water quality needs to be monitored, and then probably additional steps. But how often do you see people which come with the best intentions in the world, dig a hole, take out water, there's water, and then the quality is not monitored? Is it like standard that now it is always monitored, more or less, in all the new projects, or is it still a battle you have to fight?
It very much depends on the governance in a particular country. Before any organisation comes into a country, they have to be allowed to come in, and there should be certain standards that they have to meet. For example, if the organisation is installing hand pumps, is it a standardised hand pump in the country? Is this a hand pump where there are spares available, which is accepted in the country? Who's going to drill? Is that drilling company licensed? Is there a licensing system? Is there a mechanism for making sure that drillers are following certain quality standards? Is there proper supervision? And an organisation coming in, you can come in randomly, like going to the moon and drill boreholes in this community and that community. But how are they selected? How are they chosen? And where's the follow-ups? And this really comes back to in-country governance, both at the national level and at the local level. In many contexts, an organisation coming in externally from outside the country, or even a local registered NGO, non-governmental organisation, would have an agreement with the local government to be able to operate in that local government authority. And there are certain conditions around which they operate. Because, of course, if somebody externally chooses the community, what does that mean for governance? All countries want to raise access to drinking water. So the collaboration between the government and whichever entity is coming in is extremely important in terms of coordination, in terms of standards, in terms of what needs to be tested. No organisation should be working in isolation, actually. And if they are, there's, I would say, a problem either with the organisation, or there's some issue around governance, or something's not working.
Time is such an important factor here. So a Scout Foundation project that we have at the moment is in Moldova, building water systems in Moldova and sanitation systems. Yes, it's been building hardware, but it's also been around working with the governments, local and national governments, and supporting them and their institutions and following their rules. This is a country that became independent in the early 1990s as a Soviet satellite. And they've had to go on a real journey from this very centralized Soviet communist approach through sort of a kind of community management. And we're seeing this very similar stories in countries all over the world.
That governance aspect I'd like to understand with what you just said about centralized going to decentralized, and what you say about should, which is not must. You said NGOs and drilling organizations should coordinate with governments. Is that wishful thinking, or do you still have lone rangers out there which go out and do stuff?
Yeah, I used the word should. I probably should have used the word must, actually. I mean, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't, in trying to work within a context, it doesn't make sense from somebody from the outside just to come in and randomly drill a borehole. It makes sense if it's very clear from the start. Where are they going to drill? Why is that community selected? I mean, even if there are other issues and political pressures, these are sovereign states. This is not the moon.
I just have a devil's advocate question on that one, which is, if I go back to my Mar del Plata thing, which is, it's been 50 years that we're saying we have to solve that problem this decade. and 50 years of solving it in the decade, you know that there's a problem somewhere. Do local communities which don't have access to water still trust governments to provide them water?
Yeah, I think it's just too much of a general question.
Sorry.
Talking about Africa, talking about 54 different countries, and never mind how things are within their countries.
I'm honestly not even speaking about Africa. I followed the UN Water Conference in March this year, stood up the whole night to watch all of it, and to me, that was eye-opening about the inability of international organizations to cover that topic. So that's my personal opinion.
Yeah.
I came out of these 3 days devastated. It was like, that was all for nothing. The entire build-up to the conference, I had a conversation with Mina Guli, how she was running all these marathons to raise the awareness about all these people and saying, we have to do it by 2030. And then you see what's happening in this international sphere and you see, that's not going to solve the problem. So international to me is something, personally, I lost any trust.
Oh,
but I would still believe in countries.
Certainly in my work in many countries, mainly in Sub-Saharan Africa, I have met incredibly committed people working at local government level, trying their best. They may have limited resources. A district may only have money for 5 new water sources in a year, or 10 or 20. The need versus the financial capacity and the human capacity, the gap is huge. So certainly from the many professionals working for government, and I've interacted with a lot of government professionals, both at national level and local level, there's a lot of very committed people trying very hard in difficult circumstances. I'm not saying everyone's an angel, but I think it's really important not to kind of tar government with a blanket brush. That's just not fair.
I'd like to come back to something you said in the beginning of your previous answer, which is about the pumps, which are now listed. And I remember how I looked at it and said, oh, that looks kind of familiar. And you said it's the exact model. It's the India.
It's in India Mark II.
Yeah, India. Yeah. So I guess that shows how I'm a muggle. You're the specialist. If I understand right what you just said, that is now a problem from the past. Because when I discussed with David Lloyd Owen on the podcast, he mentioned how there's 150,000 abandoned pumps in Africa. And he was referring to a study by Pump 8, and actually Pump 8 updated their figures, and they now estimate that it's 300,000 abandoned pumps in Africa. And one of the reasons is that if that pump was funded by USAID would ask for that pump to be built in America, because America helps America and then America helps the world. But that stopped in the 90s. And from what I get now from what you're saying, that is all history. And so we should not see these broken hand pumps anymore.
Let's talk about the spectrum of what goes wrong and what's right with hand pumps. Mm-hmm. You have a hand pump that is installed on a properly designed, well-constructed borehole, and it's a high-quality hand pump. Okay, that's one. You may have a borehole that's not been well-constructed. There's lots of things that can be done badly with a borehole, which makes it difficult for that hand pump to work well. You may also have a hand pump which isn't of the specifications it should be. Poor quality materials, parts that break, wear very quickly. You also have hand pumps where it's the wrong material in the wrong type of water, aggressive water, and they corrode very quickly. So all those pumps that are not pumps and boreholes that are not installed of high quality, all of those categories, their performance will slip quite quickly. And some of them may become abandoned if the communities are not able to maintain them. So you have a whole set of pumps and boreholes that perform poorly and may stop working over 1 or 2 years. That's generally a construction quality, technical quality issue. That's one. Mm-hmm. Now, 2, you also have the pump the borehole's well constructed, the pump is, adhering to specifications, but there are challenges of maintaining that pump over time. So something fails and the community may or may not be able to fix that problem. And that depends on whether there are hand pump mechanics around who understand, who can remove it, who can diagnose the problem. It depends on the availability of the spare parts. So, for example, I've done some work in northern Bahr el Ghazal in South Sudan, and huge issue of lack of spare parts availability. So communities actually, they're very determined to keep their pumps working and trying all sorts of local tying inner tube around broken pipes, putting it back in the hole to keep their pumps working. Yeah. And then, of course, you have issues of finance because if something breaks, usually it's the community's responsibility to raise the funding. Are they able to do that? How big is the problem that they can fix? Is there trust within the community? or is there some support from outside to help them work in a good way? Or if it's a big problem that they can't fix. A figure of abandoned hand pumps that has so many nuances underneath it. Was it a problem at the beginning? Is it something that's just been very difficult for that community to maintain for a number of reasons?
How many broken hand pumps or how many broken tap stands or anything, that's almost not the important thing. What's important is, are people getting a service? And when that service breaks, how quickly can you get it up and running again? So this uptime principle. And that's actually led to fostering local enterprises to run rural water services, and people pay for that service. There still needs to be some subsidy from somewhere. That's part of the research findings, is that you can't just expect a rural Kenyan village to cover the entire costs of their water system, just as they don't here or in most parts of the world. But it's like, how do you target those subsidies more effectively? Because a recent World Bank report on subsidies in water found that it's actually the richer people, the richer households that benefit from subsidies, not the poorer. The poorer you are, the more you pay for water. There's a report that came out recently showing that post-Second World War, it was very government sort of top-down approaches that in many countries didn't work very well. In the 1980s and 90s, that moved very much to community management, putting the responsibility on the households and the communities to look after and pay for their own systems. Where we're transitioning to now is a much more patchwork approach, much more nuanced approach of what works best in different areas. So, for example, in very remote households, will never be reached by a water utility. So therefore, it's about self-supply. It's about how do you support rural households to invest in their own water source that is safe. What you were talking about in terms of your disenchantment at the international level is that something like water supply, it shouldn't be an international issue. It shouldn't be an aid issue. It's a local service. Where we try and work at the global level is that where we see that there is a need, in that there are so many great experiences from all over the world, both good and bad, and people learn from each other.
You mentioned several times, both of you, the financial aspect of things. Is that the major roadblocker, or is there other stuff to sort before that?
Yeah, I mean, Kirsten might have a different view on this, but certainly the discussions that I have with the development banks, so these are big institutions like the World Bank, African Development Bank, and so forth, they can mobilize resources in the tens of millions, hundreds of millions in some cases of dollars for financing national programs. The challenge is often the capacity of the governments and the institutions to use that money effectively. About 10 years ago, we were working together in Liberia, and that was an eye-opener. The money was there for Liberia, from various donors, but there weren't the institutions, there weren't the skilled people, and this was at a national level. At local government level, I mean, we actually never could find out what capacity there was.
So there was fuel for the engine, but no transmission to the wheel.
Yeah. I think so. In that case,
I would say it's three things. One, and this is from a conversation I had with a wonderful colleague of mine in Uganda a few weeks ago. One is organizing, and that's around people and systems. Finance, I think, really is an issue. And the other issue is corruption.
And number two being linked to number three, or not at all?
They're all three are interlinked.
You mentioned how it's expensive to be poor, and actually that is the main thesis of Gary White and Matt Damon's book, The Worth of Water, in which they outline how there's this coping cost of not having access to basic water and sanitation, which they estimate at $300 billion per year. So that's the cost of the situation we're in. On the other hand, when we look at how much it would cost to finance SDG 6, it's about $116 billion per year. If you do simple whiteboard calculation, it costs the word 300 billion to be in the situation we're in, and it would cost the word 114 to solve so it's a no-brainer. Economically speaking, spend 114 and you save 300, so people have much better lives and you save money. I look at that, to me, problem solved. I can't be the only one to do that calculation, and if it was so simple, it would be solved by now.
Yeah, so about 10 years ago, I was working in integrated water management in the UK, and they're quite an innovation in the UK at the time to really look at water supply, wastewater, nature conservation, all the different aspects of water for one town in Kent. When you looked at overall, there were some no-brainer decisions in terms of overall, this is the right thing to do in terms of like wastewater treatment or managing flood risk. The problem was that the people who paid were not the people that benefited. So what you're saying in that calculation is probably broadly correct, but in terms of the winners and losers within those numbers, the incentives probably aren't lined up, because some people will be asked to pay more and they'll go, well, what's in it for me? Or that's not in my mandate. This is another thing dealing with government and other organisations, is that you have all these discussions and they'll go, that's not my job. Absolutely. No, that makes absolutely sense. But I don't have the mandate to do that.
I had a conversation with George Macro from Dig Dip, and he was calling that the wrong pocket symptom. At the end of the day, it's the same body, but if it comes out from the right pocket and it goes into the left pocket, then right pocket will feel like, why is it my pocket which is taken?
When you just look at the water issues alone, it's a no-brainer. However, there are also other issues which are important and which people may see as more important. People living certainly in African countries, I would argue, rural populations don't have a lot of political voice. I mean, here there are lobby groups of farmers in Switzerland that have, they have organised, it comes back to organisation, they've organised themselves. But we're talking about people who live in remote areas, okay, now with telecommunications are much more connected than they were before, but people where there's lack of electricity, for example, or road infrastructure is very poor. And so governments, both at national level and at local level, have to take decisions because their resources are limited. What do they focus on? Do they focus on roads? Do they focus on schools? What about healthcare facilities? And then you have also many countries with huge increases in population. I mean, the Uganda population has more or less doubled in 25 years. So there's a challenge of keeping up with population, with infrastructure. So decisions are taken about where to invest at a political level, both nationally and also internationally. What do the development banks want to fund? What are the trends? Climate change finances is a big focus at the moment. Is that going to help? Is that going to distract water? But you stand here sitting with somebody looking at primary education. That is the key issue. Sit with somebody looking at that. So these are all huge demands. So the decision of what to fund is a political decision at the end of the day. Kind of linked to that, there's also inflationary things that need to be considered, from an economic perspective. If you invest an awful lot in a particular area, that has an inflationary impact. And that's why these targets, I need this 2030 target is hugely important to mobilise action. But in practice, it's going to take much longer. It's complex and highly politicised.
Yeah, but what's great about the SDGs as a framework, it's a framework. Challenge then becomes around, the prioritisation. And in rural water, you can see it in two kind of different ways. One is that as a public service, it's a utility bill that you pay. And so therefore it's a burden on the household. Every day, every month or whatever, they've got to find cash in their pocket to pay for drinking water. Or you look at water from flip that and say water is actually an income generator. If a household or group of households has a secure water supply they can use for growing food, for growing fodder crops, for livestock watering, for artisanal economic activities, it becomes less of a burden on the state that's got to be paid, and more of an income generator. The trouble is that then you're kind of getting out of the nice vertical integration of like the water supply as a utility, and you're getting more into multifunctional stuff. And multifunctional stuff delivers multiple benefits, but is much less easy to measure in terms of like, if we put in this money here, we will deliver that impact there. Doesn't always create the right incentives.
I have one comment and two questions on that. The first comment is, you mentioned the increase in population. I have to be fair to what I said about my disenchantment on international organizations. If you look at the Millennium Development Goals, they brought access to water, I think it was MDG 7, to 1.8 billion people, but the world's population between 2000 and 2015 increased by 1.8 billion as well. So they ended up at a net zero in terms of number of people who still don't have access to water, but in absolute terms, 1.8 billion people got access to water. So not implying that they do nothing. It's just that, yeah, you have to cope with the demographics. You mentioned SDG as a framework. When I sat down with John Robinson from Mazarin Ventures, who's looking at it from a different perspective. But what he's saying is that he's not investing in any business which would look at SDG 6, because that's not the right way to look at water. He's investing in business which look at SDG, I'm going to have the numbers wrong, but 2, 3, like end poverty, no hunger, better health access. Because it says if you want to end poverty, then people need to have water as a creator of wealth, exactly what you said. If you want people to and hunger, then you will need to grow crops, and growing crops requires water. So that's going to solve the access for water by itself. So are we wrong by focusing on water? And should we just focus on all the other ones and think that water is the byproduct?
The SDGs are a global political commitment. Political.
Sounds like a keyword. I'm getting that one.
Yeah, it's a global political commitment by all the countries who've signed up to the SDGs. There's also human rights. The human rights to water and sanitation is a legal obligation. And within the human rights, let's focus on water, within the human rights to water, there are, a set of kind of underlying attributes in terms of safety, in terms of accessibility, etc. To kind of just talk about water for business, I wonder if it can undermine the human right to safe drinking water. Not everybody is a business person. And within a community, there will be people who have disability issues, who are particularly poor. You have all people, you have all sorts of groups within a society. And by just focusing on water for business, for those who are capable of business, is that really going to trickle down to water for everyone? Access to safe water is a human right and a legal obligation. So let's really make sure that when we are looking at water, we're not just thinking of one aspect, but we're thinking of both. We're thinking of the business aspect, but we're also thinking of every single person in that community having access. And I struggle to believe that only focusing on water as a business opportunity can deliver that. I question that.
On that human right topic, if I'm right, the exact phrasing is there's a right to affordable water. And the word affordable implies that water doesn't come for free. So it's an economical good. I get your point that not everybody is a business person. But if you don't take into account this cost of water and this value of water, then you're doomed to never be able to finance that water pays water scheme.
But does it all have to be financed within water?
So you're saying something else could be paying for water?
Yeah, I mean, it does here. It does in Europe. Water doesn't just finance itself. Most of the water utilities are subsidized, whether it's major maintenance in the West.
I'm French. In France, we have this rule of water pays for water. I'm a water engineer trained to that dogma. So water pays for water, and it has to. And it creates debates because people believe with arguments that the first 50 liters shall be free.
And how many years of infrastructure were paid for before that came into being? That's another question.
The problem, that's an interesting
we're off script now, which is good.
The problem is rather on the horizon, because that was the rule forever. But the result of that is that now we are renewing the infrastructure at a 0.5% renewal rate every year. So we assume infrastructure will last 200 years. Which it will not. So at some point you will have a problem.
Exactly.
Yeah. To which the counter argument is to say just raise the price of water and you cover that. But that's Europe for Europe. But honestly, and the reason why I was sitting down with George Macpro from Dig Deep is that he's looking at people who don't have access to water in the United States. And it's 2 million people in the wealthiest country in the world. When we think of 2.2 billion people who don't have access to water, that's abstract because it's a huge number, and huge numbers, we don't grasp those huge numbers. That's a full sidetrack. I don't want to take you to that one. I'm coming back to what you mentioned about what I would maybe simplifying grassroots level in going at that granular level where governments or large organizations will have their struggles to trickle down up to that level. That's where I find the approach from water.org super interesting with their water credit, because they have this no questions asked water loans. So they're loaning money to the poorest people on earth without any background check, just because they're financing these access to water. And they get a payback rate on their loans of 99% without any background check, and with people which are really the poorest people on earth. They estimate that by now they've helped 50 million people to gain access to water, which would make me think, but that's really just my gut feeling, they're probably the single organization which have access to most people to water as we speak. Is there a limit to that approach? If you give more money to more micro banking organization, which will give more microcredit in the Mohamed Yunus Nobel Prize approach, would that solve it?
I've known and spoken to Water.org for over many years. My understanding is that they're mainly working in urban, peri-urban areas and with institutions that work in those areas. So that taps into a broader issue of, like, when you're getting into rural, access to financial services, because I believe Water.org don't lend directly. They
lend to organizations that lend.
They support lenders. Urban areas are much more in the cash economy. I would be interested to see if and how that could be adapted to rural, just because a lot of incomes are seasonal or barter. They're not necessarily in the cash economy. So how that would work with microfinance. But to be honest, I don't know enough of the detail of this area. It is an interesting approach because that's a harder sell. I guess it helps when you have a Hollywood actor doing the selling.
It's one of the points actually in the TED Talk of David Denberger, which you shared to me. There's a lot of things inside that TED Talk, but one of them is he's showing how in development water, the power is with the donor, and the donor wants to see that exact picture you were referring to, which he calls in his TED Talk, that picture is a lie, of someone standing next to the pump having water. And if donors want to fund that, and you don't have Matt Damon to convince them to fund something else, then maybe that MrBeast video is a benediction, because now 150 million people got a bit of interest into the topic. So now we could double down on that and say, now that we have your attention, here's what we should be funding. And it might be partially drilling wells, but it might be the quality we discussed. It might be the organization. It might be bringing the structure and all the other aspects. How do you bring that message across?
I wish I knew the answer. If I knew the answer, I would have done it. It's just trying to help people understand that it's not a simple tick box answer, and just helping people, I think, to appreciate that water is, the provision of domestic water and drinking water is much more than drilling that borehole. There's a whole set of things that happen before that, and there's a whole set of things that happen after that. So it's helping people to see that this, what they're seeing in this video, is one event of something which is actually much longer and much deeper. So it's like a point in a box.
But is money clever enough to understand that?
In the donor world, there's much more nuance of understanding. Definitely. If you look at what different donors, NGOs are funding, there are organizations who are just worrying about the post-construction. They're just thinking, okay, so who can keep supporting those communities? How do we make sure that mechanics can fix the pump? How do we make sure that communities are contributing enough? How do we get some subsidies in? There are organizations, donors focusing on that. There are also others thinking about the regulatory context. There are others thinking about groundwater resources, monitoring and management and understanding the resource. So, how much can we drill? How clean is the water? It's very nuanced. Not everybody is, thank goodness, not everybody is focusing on that bit.
When we talk about donors, we need to acknowledge that there's a broad range here, from small family foundations all the way up to the big multilaterals that were mentioned earlier, with into the hundreds of millions. One of the things that we've seen is the importance of research, good quality research to inform programming. So we are seeing that there is a shift in how aid donors are moving. And likewise with this USAID program, they were asking these questions of how can we as the United States change how we do aid so that it's not about just broken hardware in the bush, but it is about really supporting targeted interventions that just change incentives. And a lot of this comes down to having skilled individuals. So just like education, training, skills throughout, we just need this pipeline of talent. That's why we've got this really successful mentoring scheme of connecting young people that are really passionate about water and really want to do something, and sort of matchmaking to a 9-month journey together and learn where they want to go, where do they see themselves fitting. Or maybe they might conclude, actually, this was really great, but I'm going to do something else. I don't see my role in where I thought it was.
I'm delighted to take your word on finance and money getting more clever. I just have a devil's advocate question, which you can wash off if you believe that thing is sorted into a story of the past. It's just an example from two of my former guests on this podcast, which have very diverging opinions. One is from Source Global. So Source Global is a company which is doing atmospheric water generation with hydro panels, which are solar panels. So it's fully off-grid. You can install it wherever you want. That's one part of the story. The second part of the story is Christopher Gasson. He's the CEO of Global Water Intelligence. And one of his most famous editorials is that he did an editorial on Source Global saying it's the most egregious waste of money. Because actually Source Global has been 2 years in a row the most funded water company in the world. To be the most funded once is incredible. To be twice and 2 years in a row, and they're backed by Jeff Bezos, Jack Ma, Bill Gates. What they offer as a value proposition is that you're in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the bushes in Australia, in the middle of Native American reserves, or in the middle of Sub-Saharan Africa. You install a panel and you get water, a bit of water. It's the most expensive water in the world, but it's something which people can invest in. And I don't want to take sides on Source or Global Water Intelligence, so let me couple it with a second question. There is a program on French TV, which is the French adaptation of Shark Tank, where investors can invest into entrepreneurs. Last year, there was a special episode where they brought in all the sharks because the guy was presenting a plastic sphere, where you would put whatever water inside that sphere, water would evaporate, distillate, trickle down, and you would get drinking water. And they sold that as a way to cover all the water needs in Sub-Saharan Africa. And they sold it as solve all the water problems, when in fact you're solving maybe 1 or 2 liters a day, and it's just a distillation of water. There's nothing outlandish. They were asking for 500,000. They got $1 million. So they raised $1 million on that TV show because that saves water. So my point is, maybe there is clever money, but there's still a lot of appeal to, not talking of Source, talking of the second one, of snake oil.
We could talk about wash technologies till the cows come home, couldn't we? I think that's kind of where we both started out. So just SCAT, the acronym originally. So SCAT was founded in 1978 as the Swiss Centre for Appropriate Technology. So this was part of the Small is Beautiful movement. It was really focused on, rather than just like importing tractors, modern tractors into Africa and then breaking down, can something be co-created with it in the countries that fits the context? Technology is incredibly appealing, but the more you get into it, the more you kind of drift away from the technology itself and realize it's everything we've been talking about in terms of governance, in terms of incentives, just supply chains, the quality control. It's that classic thing of pilots never fail and never scale. There are so many great ideas that pilot well and then just that valley of death also sweeps up some bad ideas. Before I hand over to Kirsten, though, just on the air one, because I did my undergraduate and my master's thesis on fog water harvesting based on the work done in the Atacama Desert.
With the nets?
With the nets, yeah. Because in 1996, I went to Namibia as a young science leader, and I wanted to study the climate of the Namib Desert to see if it was fog water harvesting technology could be applied in the Namib Desert.
My PhD looked at innovation diffusion, and I'm really interested in technology, and it's exciting to see new innovations. It's also exciting to see innovations that are non-technological. For example, the Upgrow Consortium, which is trying to find different ways of making sure that systems are maintained. So I'm really interested in innovation. But I think it's always important to think, who is benefiting? Is this going to benefit few people here and there? Is this really going to have a widespread impact? How much money is coming in? And where is that money going? Who is being paid for? It's perhaps doing good for a few people, but what about everybody else? And this human rights everybody has to safe drinking water. So those are some of the questions I have. So if an organisation comes up with a technical solution and is fundraising for it, is it putting its account in the public domain? Are we seeing who is benefiting financially from that? And that applies not just to the private sector, but also to the charity sector, the NGO sector. It may be a corruption issue, but it also may be who's benefiting most from this. So there's a lot of noise can be made about innovations, but who is the real beneficiaries? And is that bringing up everybody's access to safe water?
I could be spending the day discussing that matter with you. I will come to the last section because I need to be cautious of your time of that deep dive, where I have 2 remaining questions. The first is super simple question. super difficult answer for you, I guess. What are 3 do's and 3 don'ts of a water development project?
How does it fit within the local context? And there's a whole set of aspects about planning, it's about the environment, it's about the users, it's about the local governance, it's about other agencies. So the fit. And are people really thinking about the fit, or are they drilling a borehole on the moon? 2 is the quality of the implementation. And that means the quality of the preparation for before that source is constructed, the quality of the drilling, let's say it's a borehole, the quality of the infrastructure, really ensuring that that quality is considered. And the 3rd aspect is the longevity. And that relates to a whole set of issues, including monitoring the resources over time, looking at spare parts, looking at how it's managed, looking at how it needs to, when it needs to be replaced. So that would be my quick: the fit, the quality, and the longevity.
So that's the do's. And what about the don'ts?
Go to Sean first for the do's.
Do's, investing in people, because I think people are as much of the legacy of a good program, good intervention as the visible hardware itself. And then linked to that, I think, is trust. It's a word that's not mentioned very much, but it's just like building trust is absolutely critical to everything. Social capital comes back to this people thing. So we're getting well beyond water, because any kind of development is around cohesion, talented people, incentivized to do the right thing.
Your 3 do's would be the people, the structure to support the people, and the trust.
Yeah.
What about the don'ts?
I mean, I would say don't work in isolation. Don't sprinkle pepper around. Focus. And don't think that you know everything. So that they all have like do's. Don't work in isolation. Work with others. Don't pepper, but focus and spend time. Don't think you know everything, but listen, really engage.
Probably don't think that you're the first person to come up with that idea, whatever your idea is. Really do the research.
So that's the flip side of that.
Don't stretch it.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah.
I think we have lots of do's and don'ts, far more than what I would have dreamed of. So thanks for that. I have a closing question. What's your now subjective feeling about it? Is it good news that the biggest YouTuber on the planet does a video about that, gets the same traction he usually gets with his stuff, where people have to avoid breaking a laser and can earn $1 million because that's the usual content on his channel? So he gets similar numbers with the water topic. So is that a pure positive, or is the limited narrative in a 13-minute video? So I'm giving him the credit that he probably teamed up with the people who made him do all the steps you just explained, both of you, during the past hour. But the fact that he just highlighted the part where you drill a well, water explosion, people standing next to it, is not carrying on the right message. What dominates in you right now?
I would say that overall it's a good thing that it's reaching a large number of people, probably a younger generation, that are not maybe aware of clean water is even a thing. From that point, I think it's good, and that hopefully it will trigger some people, a good number of people, to find out more and then explore and hopefully not be turned off. The style of communication is important, because if cynicism creeps in, if people Googled a bit superficially and this all seems very fake, then cynicism sets in and we're going backwards. I think you're always going to get those sort of people, but I think hopefully there will be enough people that see it, get inspired, do proper research, and find these different organizations that have been a longer track record and go, okay, this is something I'd like to get more involved in.
Just before letting you answer, Kirsten, just to react on what you just said, I can testify of that. My commentary video to his own video was watched over the past 3 weeks, where it was published for over 500 hours. I have videos which have made more views in absolute views, so I can't predict the future. I don't know how that one will behave, but none of them captivated the people for that long per view, which means people watch the MrBeast video, and then they have, not all of them, not 147 million of them think that way, but they watch it and think, oh, there must be more to it. Let me dig deeper. And so the next step might be my video or others which came out, And hopefully the next step, once they scratch the surface with that, will be our conversation today, which is now that we understand there's more to it, what are the people which are actively working that field for all this time? What are they doing and what are the do's and the don'ts? And so I would hope that it's like a funnel. And even if we lose people at all the stages of the funnel, we now have 150 millions which are on the top of that funnel. That will trickle down more people down that funnel. That was my very personal opinion on that. I'll let you give you yours.
I mean, he's clearly done something. Otherwise, we wouldn't be sitting here talking to you. So he's done something. I don't want to judge yet. For me, it's too early. Just a bit like when you drill that borehole, it's too early to know whether it's going to last because that takes time. He's clearly had an impact. He's drilled a borehole, for want of a better word. So it's kind of, let's see what others do, but also what he may or may not want to do. I mean, if he's so influential, is he prepared to think about the nuances and bring that to an audience? Or is this now the role of the rest of us to do? So for me, the jury's still out.
That's an awesome conclusion for that deep dive. Thanks a lot for that.
It's time for the rapid fire questions.
The first one, I think you partially answered already, is what is the most exciting project you've been working on and why? Is that project you mentioned where...
Liberia one.
Yeah, you have jokers anytime.
I'm going to talk about the Liberia work because I learned an awful lot doing that. It really brought home to me the importance and power of individual capacity and of confidence. So when I talk to people about what I do, which is quite hard to explain because it's so diverse, it's one area, but I do lots of different things. I actually bring that example quite a lot, just trying to show with a project where we were developing a report with, I think it was 10 different departments and in different ministries working together. Just what you can do by raising skills and raising confidence and supporting the interaction. So that's definitely one of my top projects.
For me, right now, it's knowledge brokering. It's the role that we play as a network to take the latest of cutting edge academic and implementation research for the Real Water Programme, the REACH programme, and connecting that to the actors that need and are wanting evidence so that their interventions are more evidence-based.
Can you name one thing that you've learned the hard way?
When I started my PhD research in Uganda, I learned the hard way about making sure that people don't lose face in public. How criticising people in front of others, I really learned a lot about that, and that was hard.
I think I learned that I shouldn't be a field engineer building real water systems, and that was in Guatemala in the late 90s, feeling like a third wheel because I was with these fantastic people that were just like digging trenches like nobody's business, putting pipes in. The local chief engineer would sort of ask me for stuff, and I'd be like, oh no, I've just done a few kind of hydraulic calculations and I think, this is right. It was a great experience, but I was the beneficiary of that project, not them.
Is there something you're doing today in your job that you will not be doing in 10 years?
Right now, it's interesting. I know it's a cliche right now, but AI, the AI is really interesting. A lot of these fads like drones and blockchain and all this kind of stuff, you just go, yeah, whatever, 3D printing. That are all going to change the world and haven't really. But I think what we're seeing with a lot of these AI tools are some real opportunities to change how we do what I've been talking about in terms of knowledge brokering, maybe in terms of online training, because the scale of what we're trying to do. I mean, rural water supply, we're talking about a service for half the world's population. In RWSN, the RWSN Secretariat is 4 of us, and 3 of them are working part-time. We're tiny. AI isn't
an enabler.
An enabler. Gives us superpowers in terms of the ability. We're already using it with tools like DeepL or whatever for translation. Fortunately, I'm in a multilingual team that are able to check the quality, but it just allows us to do things in other languages so much more quickly and efficiently. But we're exploring with partners how to develop quality control tools in this so that people can get good quality advice. Because if we don't, people will be going to ChatGPT and these other tools and asking them, how do I design a rural water system? And they'll be getting shonky answers. So it's almost a responsibility for us to work with partners to develop a good quality tool that's drawing on a good quality set of reviewed information so that it is providing reliable information. But if we're able to do that, then instead of having 15,000 members, we should have 150,000 more, subscribers, users of our kind of platform, because that's the minimum scale that we need to do, but there just isn't the funding to do that, and that's not going to change any time soon. So
super interesting.
So mine is really pragmatic. I've been leading and co-leading the theme within the Rural Water Supply Network called the Sustainable Groundwater Development Theme. I've been doing that for 18 years. I started doing it when I still lived in Uganda, and I'm stepping down at the end of this year, 2024. So I will not be doing that for another 10, never mind 18 years. So that's my very pragmatic response to that question.
I have one which is totally not in my usual list, which I'm serving to anyone, but I'm just drawing on that exact question. None of you told me I'm out of a job in 10 years. But if the entire world gets access to water and wastewater by 2030, which is in less than 10 years, you should be out of a job in 10 years.
No, because right now, RWSN and rural water supply in low middle income countries is defined within the aid world. What I'd like to see is that we're no longer in the aid world. We're a professional association of rural water professionals around the world, and that will always be there, because as long as there is a service there and there are people needing water, there needs to be professionals to support that service. No, I don't see ourselves putting ourselves out of a job. I see ourselves changing the job.
I love that perspective. So I'm happy that you came up with a clever answer to my silly question.
I also think I'll still have a job, partly because quite a big proportion of what I do is kind of research related, and even if people have access to water, I think there will always be need to look at certain elements of improving services, of looking again at some of those who remain left behind. So I think there'll still be plenty to learn in not only 10 years, but 30, 40, 50 years. I don't think I'll be that old.
Two rapid fire questions remaining. The first one is, what do you want people watching or listening to this, what do you want them to do right now?
Join the Rural Water Supply Network,
which they can do on the SCAT Foundation's website?
On the RWSN website, which is rural-watersupply.net.
So the link is in the description. Check it out.
If they're interested in the topic, just to keep finding out a bit more about it and to talk to others about it. Yeah, start thinking, discussing, arguing about this issue, and let's have that as one of the topics we talk about alongside climate change, alongside all sorts of other topics.
And if they are alone, which was one of your don't do it alone, where do you advise them to go and find those peers to talk with?
Talk to your friends, talk to your neighbour. I mean, if you're not in the water sector but are interested in this topic, talk to other people about it. The Rural Water Supply Network is a great place to find lots of documentation. Google, talk, think, discuss. But if you're on your own, go knock on a neighbour's door and ask them for a cup of tea.
Or, of course, subscribe to that channel. That was my plug. I was asking before for the honest answer, and then I can have my dishonest answer, which is subscribe to the channel.
That's a funny one, actually. That's a nice one.
It was a blast having that conversation with the two of you.
That was like major. That was like really intense.
That was intense. Oof.
I need a good lunch now.
If people want to follow up with you, where is the best place for me to redirect them? You mentioned the RWSN website. Is there another one?
Or scatfoundation.ch. Yeah.
So to follow up with my two guests, you can just check the show notes. Everything is in there. Thanks a lot, and I hope to talk with you in the future.
Great. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to Don't Waste Water. This podcast was brought to you by GF Piping Systems. Loved this episode? Head over to Apple Podcasts to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. See you next time.